What's up, merfolk? It's time to talk about one of my favorite commanders, Talrand Sky Summoner. There's precious little lore on Talrand Sky Summoner. Talrand is a merfolk wizard who hangs out in the Capsho seas of Chandalar. This blue guy has legs, for some reason, and has ancient beef with a dragon named Kalintri. The problems all started when Kalintri started exploiting the labor of the drakes of the region, and thusly did the beef originate. Drakes in MTG lore are relatives of ancient dragons, like the second cousins or whatever. Drakes' minds are more like that of animals, and they just aren't able to control the means of production as well as the dragons because the dragons possess generational wealth. Dragons also have opposable thumbs on their forelimbs, while drakes just have wings. Anyways, Talrand unionized the drakes, and a large flock organized a strike at Kalintri's warehouse, and ultimately the dragon died during labor negotiations. The drakes agreed to hang out with Talrand, and they partied because from that day forward they were guaranteed a living wage. Talrand is a 2/2 legendary merfolk wizard for 2 and 2 blue. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a 2/2 blue drake creature token with flying onto the battlefield. I gotta tell you, I'm a fan of the man. Number one, he's blue, which is a huge plus. I mean, the guy's literally blue, his skin's blue. He strikes me as kind of a laid-back Matthew McConaughey type guy. Alright. He's wearing seashells and just random stuff he finds in the ocean, kind of like a beach hippie or something. He's got a drake hat, which seems like a fashion faux pas, but maybe he thinks he's a drake, like those little kids that wear dinosaur hats. Maybe he's actually Drake, the rap artist from Canada. Today we're going to talk about why Talrand makes such a fantastic budget commander. First off, he's 35 cents. Secondly, we can run all basic lands and some utility lands as our budget allows. Third, he's mono blue. Blue has some great removal, and we can add 1 and 2 mana ramp artifacts that we can get for just a little money. And lastly, we can focus on a single effect. A common theory taught in creative writing classes is the principle of the single effect, originated by Edgar Allan Poe. Poe aimed to use every sentence, every phrase, every word in his short stories to generate a single emotional response from the reader. For Poe, it was horror and sadness. For us, in our deck building exercise, we want instant speed action. So we're talking about blue instants. What kind of instants should we include? Well, we should have a lot of cantrips. We want cheap instants that replace themselves. We should be generating a lot of drakes, and we want our instants to gas us up for the next couple turns. Talrand is a thinking man's commander, and we have to engage with every spell our opponents are casting. Talrand's going to need lots of protection because he's very vulnerable. He won't be attacking, and we don't have Lightning Greaves or Swiftfoot Boots. Why? Because they aren't instants. We instead want to pass our turn after playing a lonely island and cast our instants on our opponent's turns to protect Talrand and generate value. That means counter spells, counter effects. We want cards that can save him from targeted removal, and we want counter spells to deal with mass removal. We want our opponents guessing what we have up our sleeve. This deck demands concentration. You don't want to waste resources countering things that don't directly affect you. You can afford to have your opponents put some things out, develop their board states, as long as they aren't comboing off. This deck makes you think about and engage with everything our opponents do. Before we get too deep into things, pun intended, let's take a look at some enablers that are cheap and work great in this deck. I have 2 lists up on Moxfield, so I'll take you through my budget deck with reasonable upgrades. First, we want some mana acceleration. One card that is fantastic mid, early, and late game is High Tide. For 1 blue mana, until the end of turn, all islands produce an additional blue when tapped for mana. I have no qualms casting this turn 3 to power out Talrand early. On turn 3, most of our opponents are still developing their board states and ramping, so Talrand is unlikely to eat removal this early. Late game, this can power out our more expensive sorceries, and it comes with a little Drake friend if Talrand is on the battlefield. Our ramp should be 2 mana, and we should have plenty of it. We want to see Talrand turn 3, if possible. Mindstone, Arcane Signet, of course the old standby Soul Ring, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Liquimetal Torque round out the 2 mana slot. It's also reasonable to add mana dorks like Ornithopter of Paradise and Silver Myrrh to act as early blockers and power out Talrand for turn 3. Are you a high roller like me? Just kidding. Reasonable upgrades include Felwar Stone, and if you have one, Sapphire Medallion. I've toyed around with including Heraldic Banner. It's a 3 mana rock. As Heraldic Banner enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0. Tap, add 1 mana of the chosen color, which would be blue in our case. This gives our Drakes a cheeky little bonus. A card I want to highlight for this deck is Curious Homunculus, who taps to add colorless. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, transform Curious Homunculus. He transforms into Voracious Reader, a 3/4 Eldrazi Homunculus. He's got Prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. Instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. That's kind of the meat of this card, and the reason why we want to flip it. This is a bit of a pet include, but I think it fits our theme and it's great in this deck. There are 2 cards that enable our spell slinging strategy by drawing us into more spells. These are relatively unique effects, and I think it's worth running both. Wavebreak Hippocamp is a 2/2 Horsefish for 2 and a blue mana. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, draw a card. We're going to be casting quite a few instants and lots of counters. The floor on this one is an extra card per turn cycle, and the ceiling is 3 extra cards. Straight out of Strixhaven is Archmage Emeritus. This card is $250 and you should probably buy one. This is the best spell slinging enabler in the game, and it's worth every penny. It's 2 and 2 blue for a 2/2 human wizard, which are both relevant creature types. Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. Simple, elegant, effective, and very powerful. A couple other creatures I'd like to highlight are Auger Bolus. I have him in both the budget and non-budget versions of this deck. This card is better than it seems. In this deck, it replaces itself, lets us dig, and provides a big butt early blocker. Your mileage may vary, but I like to imagine him talking like a Murloc. It can also be replaced with Baral, Chief of Compliance. That card's about $5 and is also fantastic in this deck. Time to talk about one of my favorite specs for 2021. If you feel like spending $8, Holebreaker Horror is a fresh little lobster. This card is an incredibly powerful control deck win condition. This makes every instant into a Venser Shaper Savant. Kind of. It's a 7/8 for 5 and 2 blue. Flash. The spell can't be countered. Whenever you cast a spell, choose up to 1. Return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. There's a lot of text here. Basically, it has flash. You pass the turn with 7 mana open, and on your last opponent's end step, cast Holebreaker Horror. If you untap with this, every spell you cast is bouncing or effectively countering whatever's on the stack, and it's a cast trigger. Last game I played, this countered an incendiary command that would have wrecked my board. My opponents couldn't do too much about it, couldn't afford to cast it twice. Everybody scooped because I was returning everything to owner's hands, and I was stacked full of spells for my next turn. Talrand can afford to run some hate pieces that don't gum up the works in our deck. These cards are a little pricey, so buckle up, Buttercup. Meekstone prevents our opponents from untapping their big beaters. This can be cast during our turn, so the big fellas our opponents just attack with become useless. Torpor Orb is now $25. Mamma mia. This costs just 2 mana and says, creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. This doesn't bother a Talrand deck because we aren't playing any ETB effects. This just sits there as a collective groan emanates from our opponent's neutered decks. Everybody loves playing enter the battlefield effects in Commander. They're usually fantastic. That's why Torpor Orb is $25. Overburden is a little enchantment out of Prophecy and just wrecks creature decks. This thing has to go or our opponents can't cast any creatures. Whenever a player puts a non-token creature onto the battlefield, that player returns a land they control to its owner's hand for just 1 and 1 blue mana. This is the only good card out of Prophecy. Wait, Ristic what? Since we're running a bunch of islands, we can work in some great utility lands. Arcane Lighthouse is about $5 and can give us some ability to deal with hexproof creatures. Riptide Laboratory is about 35 cents right now. This can return Talrand to our hand if we run out of counter spells. I also included a Reliquary Tower because we are generally drawing a lot of cards. There are others worth running, so check out some classic utility lands. Alright, now we can get to the meat of the deck, the single effect that colors our world. I do run a few sorceries in addition to the 40 to 45 instants in this Talrand deck. Blatant Thievery can get us our opponent's best things. It's a few dollars. I love this card. I also run Portent, which allows us to target our opponents when they play a Vampiric Tutor or Enlightened Tutor. Plus it's a cantrip. Gataxi Probe is great in this deck. It's free, basically, 2 life, and replaces itself and triggers Talrand. I have a few Time Warps as well. I didn't include in the budget deck because that's like $15. I do run those as well in the more expensive version of this deck. Talent of the Telepath is a really interesting card for 2 and 2 blue. Target opponent reveals the top 7 cards of their library. You may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among them without paying its mana cost. Then that player puts the rest into their graveyard. Spell Mastery. If there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, you may cast up to 2 instant and or sorcery spells from among the revealed cards instead of 1. So we're effectively casting 3 spells, triggering Talrand thrice times, and getting us whatever value our opponent is running. Last game I played, I got a Savin's Reclamation and Echo of Eons, which is pretty decent for 4 mana. It could also whiff, so it's a bit of chaotic fun, but you have to target the right opponent. Spell Twine is a good option as well, at least you know what you're getting. You're definitely going to want some instant card draw to keep the train running, so we have Keep Watch, which can be cast on an opponent's attack step, or we can weaponize our armada of drakes into a full hand. Our old standby Fact or Fiction is in there. Frantic Search is a free roll on our opponent's end step and can get rid of excess lands for more gas. Plagiarize is a little pricey mana-wise, but I've cast it in response to wheels or draw spells. Epiphany of the Drown Yard can be played right before we untap if we find ourselves without anything else that needs countering during the turn cycle. Next, we want little spells that draw us cards and have some utility. They don't have to do too much else, but we want draw cards stapled to whatever effect. We have our bounce spells, Into the Royal, Repulse, Snap. Aetherize can be absolutely brutal for our opponents. I have Cyclonic Rift in my expensive version, and that card will definitely devastate our opponents. It's not really even a fair card, but neither is life, bucko. We have our tapping and untapping spells, Grip of the Royal, Jolt, Refocus, Bluster Squall. These can be useful to avoid attacks or clear the way for our drakes. We have cards that just draw us a card. Cards like Anticipate, Brainstorm, Impulse, Opt, and Peek. It's almost like you're splicing Created Drake onto these cards. These cards can easily be cast on our opponent's end step with whatever leftover mana we have. They read Pay Blue, Make a Drake, Do a Thing, Draw a card. We also want plenty of removal just in case a Blightsteel Colossus comes barreling across the battlefield. Cards like Leadership Vacuum can remove troublesome commanders, and it draws us a card. That's a really interesting card. Pongify and Rapid Hybridization are great. Reality Shift exiles troublesome creatures and can be useful to squash graveyard shenanigans. Turn to Frog can end some combos and is a pretty good little meme card. Next, we want protection for Talrand, and we find it in some of our counters and target changing effects. Confound, Keep Safe, Meddle, and Turn Aside change targets and can 2-for-1 our opponents. Lastly, we want counter spells. If they draw us a card, more value for us. There are very expensive counters out there. Force of Will, Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, but cheap counters are only fractionally worse. As I always say, threats are expensive, but answers are cheap. Remand is awesome in this deck, draws us a card. Disrupt also replaces itself. Exclude can get rid of creatures that enter the battlefield and destroy our stuff. Spell Pierce is another great card. Tail's End is a really good trick card in this deck. My opponents are always a little confused when I respond to an enter the battlefield trigger on the stack or something like that. You can respond to Massacre Worm if it's going to destroy your board, and overall this is a great card to keep up your sleeve. I also run some larger counter spells for late game fun. Spell Swindle can be devastating and fuels more bigger spells. Sublime Epiphany is awesome late game for its sheer utility. You're making tokens, you're bouncing things, you're drawing cards. Desertion is a semi-budget upgrade that can guarantee our opponents can't sneak in a big monster. Instead, we get it. To round out our instant spell suite, we have Tricky Nonsense. One of the great things about this deck is the fact that we can hold mana open for every specific situation. We have cards like Theoretical Duplication, Mystic Reflection, Sudden Substitution, Reigns of Power in case we get wiped. We can steal all of our opponent's boards. Reigns of Power can also be used to steal a third player's board to block an Alpha Strike, wiping both boards and setting 2 opponents back. See? Tricky Nonsense. These cards make you think, they make you a better player. You really have to dissect the stack to understand their true potential, and these are the types of cards that Talrand has room for. Honestly, when I first built this, I just took as many cool, interesting instants as I had room for from my bulk boxes. As the years went by, I acquired some more expensive cards and the list got even better. Anyways, the 2 deck lists are in the description. The budget list is around $75, not including basics. I hope you all have a wonderful day filled with drakes in the sky and drake hats and whatever else you like. So like and subscribe so we can do some more Commander deep dives. This is going to be Nicky G signing off.